Morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in the NW Heat Accessibility Working Group webinar. Terrill Thompson is our speaker today with a presentation titled Accessibility in Procurement, How to Read a VPAT. Terrill is the manager of the IT accessibility team at the University of Washington, a role in which he works to promote IT accessibility by building communities, developing resources, delivering lectures and workshops, conducting accessibility evaluations, providing consultations and support to a wide variety of constituents, and conducting research. Terrill has nearly 30 years of experience in the IT accessibility field and has presented internationally at numerous conferences and consulted with local and state governments, private industry, and K-12 and post-secondary education entities on IT accessibility issues. And before I hand the mic to Terrill, I'll just go over some logistics of the webinar. And we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. Please post any questions you have in the chat. We will be collecting them and discussing your questions during the Q&A sessions. We do provide captioning for today's webinar. You can turn on the Zoom's embedded caption viewers. We also have a link for a page opening in your browser if you want to watch for the full rundown of the captions. I will be posting the link in the chat. We are recording today's sessions, and the recording will be posted on our website, nwheat.org, shortly after. And we will send out a brief survey for today's webinar after the event. And please fill it out. It will help us for our future programmings. The link to the presentations is also posted on our website right now, nwheat.org. If you prefer to download the presentations and follow along, you can head to our website and download it right now. It is already there. Okay, so without further ado, I will be handing the mic to Terrill. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kuhn. I will go ahead and share my slides here. Did that work? Are you all seeing PowerPoint?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. This, as it turns out, is quite a hot topic. I'm going to be giving the same presentation tomorrow at the UW. And that's where it all got started. I was invited to give a presentation for our Tech Talks, which is a campus-wide focus on technology that we do periodically. And I think it was Andy Andrews from UW Libraries got wind of that and proposed it for this group. But I also am giving the same talk to 2 other groups as well over the next couple of weeks. So this is an important topic. A lot of people are making purchasing decisions related to IT, and they need to ensure that what they're purchasing is accessible, and that can be very challenging to do. We have a department at the University of Washington that does review products for accessibility, but we can't possibly review everything. There are thousands of purchases every year that are IT specific. And so we're really on a mission to try and empower the people that are out there making purchasing decisions and taking purchasing risks to understand what accessibility is all about and how to, at least at a basic level, evaluate products for accessibility, even if you're not an accessibility expert. And so that is the nature of this talk. As Kuhn said, I am the manager of the IT accessibility team at the University of Washington. So we, within UW-IT, within the central IT organization, we have a department called Accessible Technology Services. And our role is to ensure our technology is accessible. So we're not providing individual accommodations for students with disabilities. That's what Disability Services does. And then there's another group that provides accommodation for employees and for the general public. But we're more focused on the technology infrastructure and just working to make sure that that is as accessible as it can be out of the box. So I've got a web URL on the opening slide here, uw.edu/accessibility. That's our main website for communicating all sorts of things related to information technology accessibility. So check that out for additional information. I'm going to be using a few acronyms, so I thought I would clarify those up front, but we'll get into more details about each of them. W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium, so that's the organization that manages and authors most of the standards related to the World Wide Web. So HTML and CSS, these are W3C specifications, as is WCAG, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which we're going to be talking about extensively, and ARIA, that's another W3C specification, which plays an important role in technology accessibility. So that stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And we'll talk in a bit about what that's all about and what you need to know about it in order to evaluate technology products for accessibility. And we're also, in the title of this presentation, the acronym VPAT is there, and that really is the focus of this. We're going to be looking extensively at Voluntary Product Accessibility Templates, which is a form that vendors fill out to describe the accessibility of their product or service. And so we'll talk more about that, and we'll look at several example VPATs during the course of this talk. So I don't like to talk much about the law. I'm not a lawyer, and I like to think that we want to be accessible because we just do. It's the right thing to do, and we provide benefits and services and activities and resources because we want people to access them. And if there are people that can't access what we're providing, then that that should be a concern for us, even if it wasn't the law. But it is the law, and so we need to talk about that. Most of us, if we receive federal funding, then we need to comply with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That goes all the way back to 1973. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is even more broad. It's not just recipients of federal funding, it is society as a whole that needs to comply with that. And both of these are civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination against persons with disabilities. And in hundreds of legal complaints that have been filed against higher education institutions for having inaccessible IT, it has become clear that the expectation for technology accessibility is that we meet WCAG either 2.0 or 2.1. The more recent case law and resolutions and settlements point to the more current standard WCAG 2.1, but a lot of the older ones reference WCAG 2.0. We'll talk about the different versions and what WCAG means as a whole in a moment. But we know from the legal complaints and the resolutions that WCAG 2.something, level 2A, is our expected level of accessibility compliance. We also, those of us who are in the state of Washington, have Washington State policy. Policy 188 requires that all state agencies, including higher education institutions, meet WCAG 2.1 level 2A. And so that just reinforces what we already know from all of the case law and the resolutions and settlements that are out there. So, so really the purpose of this slide is just to sort of build up this knowledge and awareness that WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 level 2A is an important standard that we need to be familiar with. So what is WCAG 2.1 or 2.0? Both of these are in the 2.x family of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is an international web accessibility standard that was published by the W3C way back when. The W3C was actually formed by Tim Berners-Lee in the very early days of the web in the early 1990s. And they pretty quickly became aware that accessibility could be an issue with the web, and that was not at all their intention. The web was designed to be this great equalizer. Suddenly, the world was going to have information available at its fingertips in just unprecedented access to information and resources and sharing knowledge. And the idea that some people would be excluded from that, and that the web itself could create barriers, was completely contrary to the vision. So they created a group within the W3C called I didn't include this on the acronym slide, but the WAI, Web Accessibility Initiative, who began working very early on in the 90s on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So it took many years, as it does with standards and guidelines development, but version 1 was finally published in 1998. And it's taken even longer to get upgrades, but this is a constantly evolving standard. So version 2 was published in 2008, and version 2.1 was published in 2018. So the more recent version is 2.1. And if you drill into the WCAG, at its lowest level, the most specific level of detail, we have what are called success criteria. So these are kind of the nuts and bolts of what it takes to have an accessible website, and it is web content. The W in WCAG is web, but really a lot of these success criteria apply to technologies in general, digital technologies. So anything with a user interface, there are WCAG criteria that apply to that interface. And so this really helps us. This is the standard that really defines accessibility and helps us to understand what accessibility means. But there's a lot of detail. There are 78 success criteria. Each of those has a level assigned to it that sort of corresponds with the priority. So level A are the highest priority issues. If there's a level A violation, then there will be groups of people that just cannot access your content at all. So that's super critical, level A. But there's also a difficulty consideration that goes into the assignment of levels. So level A are not only high priority, very important issues, but they also are relatively easy to implement. Level 2A are kind of a middle ground, also important, maybe not as important as level A, or maybe not as easy as level A, but some balance between difficulty and importance. And then level 3A are either less important or more difficult still. So total 78. Early on, when WCAG 2 was published, there were lots of questions about how accessible do we need to be? Do we need to meet all 78 success criteria? That would be pretty challenging because there are some really tough ones. For example, we caption all of our videos. That is a level A issue, but you also have to add sign language for all of your videos in order to meet level 3A. So much more challenging to meet level 3A. So that was a question for a little while, but as it sorted itself out through policy and through legal cases and resolutions and settlements, it became clear that level 2A was the expectation. So that was the bar, that those 30 level A and 20 level 2A success criteria are what we are expected to meet. So I want to give just 3 examples so you can get a better sense of what these success criteria are. And hopefully with just 3 examples, it becomes a little less overwhelming than having to think about 50 different success criteria or 70 some if you're trying to meet level 3A. So let's look at one example, which in my opinion, is the most important example, the most important success criterion in all of accessibility. And we're not supposed to cherry pick. We're not supposed to say, you know, that any of these level A success criteria are more important than the others. But I really feel that this probably is the most important, and that is 1.3.1, info and relationships. This is the one that says in your markup, if it's a website, you know, you've got tags that represent heading structure, that represent labels and associate those labels with form fields. You've got tables that need to have, you know, TH tags for the table header so that the column header is explicitly identified. Basically, you know, using the tag structure that's available to you in the markup language. So in websites, we're talking about HTML, using that properly so that all the parts are very specifically identified and the relationships between those parts are identified. So headings need to form an outline of the page, and labels need to be explicitly associated with form fields, and column headers need to be identified as column headers. So all that is built in to the web application. That's what 1.3.1 info and relationships is all about. Second one, 2.1.1, it's simply titled keyboard. Both of these are level A, so the highest priority level. This says that all functionality of the content is operable through a keyboard interface. So if you are unable to use a mouse, then you should be able to tab through the page and access all the content. And then maybe some other keys play a role as well, like enter or space or escape or the arrow keys. But everything should be accessible with the keyboard. I like to include this because it's easy to test. You don't need any sort of testing software. You don't need any special skills. You just need to be able to use a keyboard, and you can then take the no mouse challenge and just try your website or try, you know, any web application that you're testing. Just try it without a mouse and see if you can do everything that you can do if you are a mouse user. So that's the second one. Finally, 4.1.2, name, role, and value. This is also a level A success criteria. And this really comes down to proper use of ARIA. And so now we're going to need to define ARIA in order to better understand what we're talking about here. So ARIA, again, is a W3C specification, stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And this emerged as the web evolved from a document delivery format. And originally it was just static documents that were on the web, but it, you know, technology evolved, and now we have very sophisticated web applications where there's just a lot of stuff that's happening on the screen at any given moment in response to user behaviors. And so users then, imagine somebody who has no eyesight, they're using a screen reader, navigating around using a keyboard and listening to you know, their user interface through an audible speech synthesis interface. And they need to know, they just landed on something, they need to know what that thing is, they need to know what its current state is, and if it's an interactive component, like maybe it's a button, and they press enter to click that button, they then need to know what just happened. If something happened as a result of them clicking on the button, they need to know what that was. Something has changed that needs to be communicated to them. This isn't possible with HTML. And so ARIA fills that gap and communicates all of those interactive things in a way that assistive technologies then can access that information and pass it on to users. So it really is a critical piece of the accessibility puzzle if we're looking at complex, dynamic, rich internet applications, which is, you know, often we are these days. So I want to just give you an example to give you a little bit better sense of ARIA. And I apologize if anybody's not a coder, but this is hopefully a simple enough example that you can get the sense. This is HTML. And let's imagine that we have a button, and that's coded there with the button tag. It has an ID of button 1, and that button has a label that says more info. So the user hears that it's the more info button if they're using a screen reader. They then know that they can press enter or space to trigger that button. And when they do so, there's perhaps some JavaScript behind the scenes that responds by showing the content in this div. So there's a div element with an ID of info1. So when somebody clicks the button 1 button, then it shows this content that otherwise is hidden. And then that div says this section contains more info. So for a screen reader user, when they click that button, they need to know then that something has happened. And as coded with this example on the screen, they're not going to know that. There's nothing here that would communicate to them that something just happened. So this is where ARIA comes in. If we add a couple of things to this, if we add ARIA controls to the button, then that explicitly points to the ID of that div and says this button controls this div. So there's a relationship that's formed then between the button and the div. And then also if you add ARIA expanded and set that to false by default and then change that to true when it actually is expanded, then that can be, both of these things can be used by assistive technologies to understand what's going on, what the current state is, and to relay that to the user. So with this markup in place, then a screen reader user will not only land on the more info button, they'll hear more info button collapsed. And when they press enter, they'll hear expanded. So they know that whatever this thing controls just expanded. And some screen readers may provide additional benefits to allow you to jump right to that expanded content. So ARIA then does play a key role. Now, my thinking here is not that you'll become an ARIA expert and to review products for accessibility. ARIA is very complex and it's unrealistic, for most people to become ARIA experts. But just to know that ARIA exists and that it plays a critical role in making rich internet applications accessible. So I want to talk just briefly about how we do procurement at the University of Washington. It may, if you're not at the UW, this won't apply to you, but you may have similar sorts of processes at your institution. We do have our procurement policies and procedures are documented on our website at uw.edu/accessibility. If you just add a /procurement to the end of that, then you can get the details about what I'm talking about here. But essentially, we've got 3 steps, kind of in an abstract sense. One is that we need to solicit accessibility information. So whenever we're about to purchase a product, or we're going out to RFP, or we're just approaching vendors, we need to ask them about their accessibility. If we don't ask, then they're not going to hear that, and they need to hear it from every single one of us, that accessibility is important, and that's going to drive them, hopefully, to change and understand that there's market potential in accessibility. Everybody wants it. Therefore, we need to develop an accessible product. Number 2, when they respond to that question, when you ask them about their accessibility and they respond, you need to be able to validate their answers. You need to be able to validate the accessibility information received. And so that's what this presentation is all about. It's kind of giving you some foundation with which to do that validating of the accessibility information that they provide. And finally, you need to include accessibility assurances in contracts. So most likely, the product or the service is not accessible. Very few products are, unfortunately. I'd love to be able to say that, they're half of the products are fully accessible, and then you get these others that are working on it. But the state of things currently is that every product I've ever seen has some accessibility problems. Some are more significant than others, but those that need to improve need to have some motivation to improve. And if you can get accessibility requirements built into the contract, at least that they're working towards, WCAG 2.1 level 2A compliance at some point, but maybe just doing baby steps, working on addressing a few really high priority issues on a certain time frame, get that built into the contract so that they have some incentive to work on it. But even products that are pretty accessible now, but maybe have a few things to fix, they too should be held accountable for fixing those few things and for ensuring that they remain accessible. So they may be accessible today. You want to make sure that they are still accessible when they roll out an upgrade, because it's pretty easy for them to break accessibility. So this is a big block of text. I'm not going to read all of this, but you can read it on our website. But this is the content that we recommend for RFPs. So if we are soliciting information from vendors, this is the language that actually procurement services has that they plug into RFPs. And then sometimes it gets customized a little bit. But at the heart of it here is letting the vendor know that we need to meet WCAG 2.1 level 2A, and that we will accept a voluntary product accessibility template as a means for you communicating how well you meet WCAG 2.1. So that's what a VPAT is a form that they can tell us how well they meet the accessibility standards. We have some additional instructions here in our statement that we have expectations that they have a recent VPAT. VPAT version 2.3 or higher is necessary because that speaks to WCAG rather than old Section 508 standards, which is not what we're trying to meet. So it needs to be VPAT 2.3 or higher, and they need to follow the instructions. So we explicitly state that because we've seen a lot of VPATs over the years where they have not provided instructions, but they have not followed the instructions, including some key pieces that we feel are important. So what is a VPAT then? It stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. It is a standard means by which IT vendors can provide documentation on whether and how they meet accessibility standards. The latest version is 2.4, I believe. I don't think that's been updated since February 2020 when that came out. But again, 2.3 is the version for reporting on conformance to WCAG 2.1. So if 2.1 is your standard, then they need to be filling out a VPAT version 2.3. Within the VPAT 2.3 family, there are different editions. There's the WCAG 2.1 version. There's also Section 508 version. There's a European Union version, and there's an international version that incorporates all of the above standards. So we accept the WCAG 2.1 version since, again, that's the standard we're trying to meet. But we would accept the international version because that also addresses WCAG 2.1. So this is what a VPAT looks like. This is an uncompleted VPAT. It has the WCAG success criterion over in the left column. It's a 3-column table, basically. And there are links, so you can, if they don't know, they need to be, educated about, or just need for a reference, they need to look at the WCAG success criterion. They can do that via the links. But then you've got a conformance level column and a remarks and explanations column. And if they read the instructions, they'll know that the conformance level is a multiple choice question. So you can either, their product either supports the success criteria, supports with exceptions, does not support, or it's not applicable, or they don't know, it wasn't tested. So the conformance level should be one of those things. And then the remarks and explanations should be an explanation of why they chose that conformance level. So give us enough detail, assuming this is our sole source of accessibility information about this product. We're putting ourselves at legal risk if we deploy a product that's not accessible. We therefore need to be informed when we make this decision. And this form provides us with, as it's envisioned, the information that we need in order to make an informed decision. So that's what we're hoping for. This is just a little bit more detail about the various options. And there's also some required metadata. Again, it's in the instructions. It's in bold in the instructions. There are 11 required fields. And we believe that there are 5 for our purposes that are the most critical of those 11. Those are the name of the product and the version, particularly the version. Usually they'll provide the name of the product, but we want to see the version so that we know exactly what what has been evaluated here. We want to see the report date. So, if this was done 5 years ago with an old version, then that probably is not going to be current. Therefore, we need an updated VPAT. We want some contact information for follow-up questions. And ideally, that'll be a person. I've seen a lot of VPATs lately where it's just the generic help contact information, which I don't feel probably is going to give us a direct line to somebody who can answer our accessibility questions. There's a required field that is the evaluation methods used. We want some specific documentation so that we know how they've gone about evaluating their product, and the applicable standards or guidelines. If they're using the right version of the VPAT, then we know it's WCAG 2.1 level 2A, but that should be explicitly stated within the metadata. So this is my quick guide to reading a VPAT. This is, again, it's pretty complicated, and there are lots of WCAG success criteria. So it can get a little overwhelming for people, but it doesn't have to. This is something everybody can review a VPAT just by looking at these few things. First of all, did they follow instructions? Did they include all of the required metadata? There are 11 required fields. If they didn't do that, did they at least include the 5 required metadata fields that we feel are really important? Did they fill the form out properly? So, a lot of this is sort of elementary school level grading. This is a multiple choice question with 5 options. If their answer is not one of those 5 options, then they didn't fill it out properly. So that's the kind of stuff to look at. It's just, understand how this form is supposed to work and look and see if they filled it out properly. If they didn't, then that actually communicates something that tells you that either they're new to accessibility and they just, have not really put a lot of thought into filling out a VPAT and did so kind of hastily in order to get their product through this process, or they just don't care that much about it. And again, it's like pushing it through. This is a formality. A VPAT is required, so here, let's crank this out and satisfy the need. And that can tell you if that sort of is their attitude about accessibility, then that's probably going to be reflected in the accessibility of their product or service. Finally, for a little bit of a deeper dive, I suggest looking just at those 3 issues. And you may want to explore beyond that, but that makes it a little bit easier to digest if you just focus on the 3 issues that we talked about. Info and relationships, because it's so critical. Keyboard, because it's so easy to test. And name, role, and value, that's the ARIA piece, because it too is so critical if what we're looking at is a dynamic, rich web application. And as you're looking at those things, and as you're sort of looking at all 3 of those, following all 3 of those steps, then ask yourself, First of all, who completed the VPAT? That should be stated up front in the metadata. Was this an independent accessibility consultant? That would be preferred for our purposes. We'd rather that be coming from an independent source as opposed to them, their marketing team filling out the VPAT. If it is them doing it internally, then, what sort of skills do they have in order to do that evaluation? That's where we really need to know more in the metadata about their methods and how they went about answering, filling out this form. Again, did they follow instructions? Do they seem to be knowledgeable of accessibility? Even if you are not super skilled at accessibility, if you just have the basics, you can often tell whether somebody else has accessibility knowledge. And probably the most important questions, after reading their VPAT, do you know more about the accessibility of their product? Because that really is what this is all about. You need to make an informed decision. And after reading the VPAT, what follow-up questions do you have for the vendor? We like to say this is not the end result. Their VPAT is not truth. It's not saying, this is an accessible product or this is not an accessible product. It's giving you a foundation, and that is a conversation starter. So use that, try to find questions within their answers that you can ask them in order to better understand the accessibility of this product. Because ultimately that fourth bullet, knowing more about the accessibility of the product, that's what it's all about. That's where you want to get to. You're probably not going to get there you might get a little bit there by reading the VPAT, but then there's got to be a conversation afterwards. So some questions that you can ask vendors. Don't ask, is your product accessible? Because that is a yes/no question. Much too easy just to say yes without justifying that. But be more specific. For example, in your VPAT, you said this related to 1.3.1 info and relationships, but I don't quite understand, if somebody's using a screen reader, what are the implications based on what you said? Can you elaborate? Can you provide some specific examples of how your product meets the success criterion? So try to be as specific as possible, and maybe even ask them to demonstrate those things. Show us how this can be used if a person has no eyesight, or if a person is using speech input, or if a person is physically unable to use a mouse. Also, let's think beyond the VPAT. Let's think beyond this particular version of this product and tell us about how your company addresses the need for accessibility throughout the product life cycle. So if they can talk about their approach to accessibility, that again, it's not a technical conversation. This is a conversation that anybody can have, and what we're hoping is that they have something built in to their culture, trainings for engineers and designers and developers, and accessibility that's built into the QA process and so forth. What is your methodology for testing your products for accessibility? So hopefully they've documented that a little bit in the VPAT, but we want to know more. How do you do this as you're designing products and developing products and testing products? And who does that testing? And which tools and assistive technologies do you use? What sort of training do your designers, engineers, and quality assurance personnel receive on accessibility? This all, again, it's all sort of built into understanding the company, understanding their culture. Is this somebody I'm comfortable doing business with? So I'll be honest that a lot of these, a lot of small companies, and probably this is true with library databases more than anywhere else, or as much as anywhere else, but they're not going to be able. They don't have accessibility built into their culture. And they're not going to be able to answer these questions in a way that is meaningful. And so the idea here isn't really just to corner them and shame them, but just by asking these questions, you will help to elevate accessibility, make that part of their, put it on their radar so that, they can start considering how they can address this. So I want to look at a few VPATs. And if we were face to face, I think I would probably want to do this interactively, but in the interest of time and because we're remote, I'll just kind of walk through this, but do sort of be thinking through these examples. And maybe I'll move slowly enough so that you can kind of try to come up with a response on your own and then compare that with my response. These are all actual VPATs, and they're all pretty recent things that I've been encountering. This was somebody's response. They've got the criteria on the left. They've got the conformance level on the right. Their conformance levels all sort of meet the multiple choice options that are available, but they chose to omit the third column. So there are no remarks or explanations anywhere. So we know that they partially support the first item, non-text content, that's the item that's all about adding alt text to images and that sort of thing. Partially supports, so it's not supports. What is the significance of the partially? We have no idea. We don't know how far they fall short. We don't know how relevant the failures are. They also they say they support keyboard accessibility 2.1.1, but there's a partially supports on the keyboard trap question. So that suggests that somewhere there's a keyboard trap or a keyboard user is going to get stuck and they're not going to be able to get out of that. So whether that's critical or not really depends on the details. How likely is a person to encounter this problem? And how significant is it in a person's ability to perform the intended functions of the product? So this is a classic case of not following the instructions. They seem to have done some sort of evaluation, and they were able to give themselves conformance level ratings, but they didn't provide us any of those details to help us understand that. Next one, we actually have a remarks and explanations column, so that's better than the first. However, the remarks and explanations are not meaningful. So the only time they actually filled anything into that column is when it was not applicable, which is probably, arguably, they don't need to say anything for remarks and explanations if it's not applicable. We want to know more detail if it supports. We want to know tell us how it supports. We're not just going to take your word for that. We want to know some more specifics about, how you came up with that conformance level. And if a product looks this good, where everything is either supports or not applicable, it's 100% accessible, then again, I've never seen a product that actually could say that. And so that's a red flag for me. 100% accessibility is a red flag. Next example, looking just at the keyboard success criteria, they say it partially supports. All functionality of the content is operable through a keyboard interface without requiring specific timings for individual keystrokes. However, there are minor exceptions. For example, the calendar widget on the manage section is not keyboard operable. However, alternatively, the date can be directly entered into the date field. So, and this goes on onto another page where there's several items where there's a particular widget that's not keyboard accessible, but they all sort of follow this pattern of, however, there is a workaround. And so the question then is that workaround sufficient? And in the case of a calendar widget, that seems perfect, that if somebody can enter the date manually rather than picking it from a calendar, pop-up calendar widget, that seems like the perfect solution. So as I review this, a couple of pieces of information come out of this experience. One is that they seem to know what they're talking about. They understand the success criterion and they're speaking to it. And they're not just identifying problems, but they're also identifying solutions. And so this is a good example. When I look at this, I'm pleased with what I see. Here's one that focuses on that ARIA success criterion: name, role, and value. They say it partially supports. And they say the web application provides the correct name, role, state, and other important accessibility information for most form controls with the following exceptions. Dynamic filter results are not announced to screen reader users, and some calendar widgets are not using appropriate roles. So with this, again, it seems that they are knowledgeable. They're being transparent and that they partially support, and there are some specific cases where they've got some problems. I have two questions based on this, though. Not knowing the product, how important is dynamic filter results, and how important is that calendar widget? And we saw another calendar widget in the previous item. Is it possible for a screen reader user to enter a date into the calendar? Is that an accessible experience if they can't access the widget itself? And the dynamic filter results, I just want to know more about the impact of that. Is that going to prevent somebody from performing a critical function of the product or the application? Also, I want to know what their plan is. So it's one thing to identify problems, but that should just be the starting point. Okay, you've identified these problems. When are you going to fix these problems? And let's get a roadmap. I want to see a roadmap that has the problems prioritized and some dates assigned when they plan to fix these problems. And this is where building that into the contract comes in, that if you've got a roadmap and you and they agree to this roadmap, then there can be some expectations built into the contract that they're going to continue to make progress on accessibility as documented in this roadmap. This example includes several items. There's one for captions. There's one for audio description. So the two video related success criteria. And then the 1.3.1 info and relationships. So for the first two, they say supports. And then they say this web app does not contain pre-recorded synchronized media. So I included those two items, even though it's not one of the three items that, that I say, focus on just these three items. You can kind of expand the scope a little bit and just kind of look around and see if you notice anything peculiar. In this case, this is a little bit peculiar in that it really is not applicable. This is a product that has nothing to do with video. Therefore, and they say that in the remarks, this does not deal with pre-recorded synchronized media. They're saying in their remarks this is not applicable, but they said supports in the center column. So that seems like maybe I'm being a little bit nitpicky, but that to me creates a little bit of mistrust. And maybe this is an innocent mistake, but to me it seems like they're trying to pad this, that center column with a bunch of supports. So if we just glance at it, we're going to see support, 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 supports, and we're going to come away thinking, wow, they are really accessible, when in fact many of those should be not applicable. So kind of the same thing with partially supports on info and relationships. They say that their web app has proper information structure and relationship text, but there are exceptions. And then they have a bulleted list of the exceptions. So I really like this VPAT in that it is transparent, provides a lot of detail for the exceptions. We come away knowing exactly where the problems lie. And this goes on and on. It's actually several pages of exceptions. And the thing that jumps out at me, given that there are so many exceptions, is that it's debatable whether they can really say this partially supports. That again, it feels like they are kind of nudging that multiple choice up a little higher than it actually is. It seems like, if you've got, well, yes, this is accessible except for these 100 cases where it's not, then probably that does not support. So again, it feels a little misleading, and my trust is compromised a little bit because of that. So those of you that downloaded the slides in advance, this is actually a bonus slide. This wasn't included in the initial set. And this is one I just received yesterday. VPATs are coming in constantly to my office. And so I got this one and I thought it was an interesting case. So I added it. This too is the keyboard success criterion. And they say it partially supports because users can operate all functions in the product using a keyboard through standard controls. A rating of partially supports has been given due to the following isolated issues that do not substantially hinder use of the functionality. And then they identify the 2 places where there are keyboard problems. I like that they answered the question that I've raised throughout this. How significant is this problem? They've addressed that, at least from their perspective, this does not substantially hinder use of the functionality. So I may or may not believe that. The functions that we intend to use this product for may differ from what they're assuming by saying that. But I like that they did say that. I also like with the rich text formatting toolbar, it's not operable with a keyboard alone, but there are keyboard shortcuts. And so, so that, it sort of speaks to the fact that there are workarounds here. It is possible for a keyboard user to use this. They just need to memorize the keyboard shortcuts. And so hopefully, those are discoverable and a person can easily figure out what they are. But finally, the reason I selected this was because of that last statement. They say a roadmap has been identified to remediate both of these known issues. And they say this throughout their VPAT. Every time they say partially supports, they provide the details and they mention this roadmap. So I want to know more about the roadmap because that was not something that they provided with their VPAT. So that's my follow-up question to them is, where is this roadmap? Can we see the roadmap? And does it include dates by which these issues are going to be fixed? Which ones are going to be fixed first? And let's get them on the hook for continuing to address their accessibility, improve their accessibility. So that I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions, but I'm willing to answer questions in however much time we have available.
All right, thank you. Thank you. And right now we already have 2 questions in the chat. And if you want to address them, the first one from Radek about how can a vendor claim that they are compliant with WCAG 2.1 AA standards, and yet their VPAT states for the 2.1.1 keyboard navigations is only partially fulfills.
Yeah, they shouldn't be able to claim full compliance. And the VPAT doesn't have a place for declaring full compliance. It's granular. It's down. Each success criterion is weighted separately, and so that really is what. And I wouldn't expect full compliance. So the question is then, which items do they partially fulfill or not fulfill at all, and how significant are those problems?
Okay. And the second question from Anne is, do you have examples of suggested contract languages that binds the vendor to address accessibility gaps identified in the VPAT? And like something more than the general statement that will meet or exceed compliance?
Yeah, check out our procurement page again, uw.edu/accessibility/procurement. We do have some contract language. It is boilerplate language that would be customized, given whatever the interaction has been with that vendor. But we also have at the University of Washington an IT accessibility rider that is included in our terms and conditions. And so in order to do business with us, if it's a major purchase, it's going through procurement services, then vendors have that rider, which is a very detailed contract about their commitment to accessibility. And a lot of vendors will actually redline that. So they'll send it back to us and say, we're not agreeing to this as is, but we'll strike out all the stuff that they feel like they're concerned about. And then it becomes a negotiation game. How much risk are you, the person making the purchase, how much risk are you willing to assume if the vendor says, no, we're not going to agree to these conditions? But we've got pretty extensive documentation on our website for where we start, our starting point in these contract negotiations.
Okay. Will you be able to say again the web address that I can find the documents?
Yep, it's in the slides, but it is uw.edu/accessibility. That's our main site. And there's actually a link there to procurement, so you can find it in the menu.
Okay.
Yep.
So the next question from Tori, being new to the reading interacting with VPATs, what should I focus on familiarizing myself with first in order to effectively assess a VPAT?
I would say, just the things we talked about in this presentation, and feel free. I think the slides are available, right, Kuhn? So feel free to review those, and look again to make sure they followed instructions, because often about half do not, and so that in itself is very telling. But then just focus on those 3 success criteria that we talked about, as that really can narrow the focus a lot, and you can learn a lot about a product just by looking at those 3.
Okay. One question: what will be your follow question if the member VPAT remarks to 2.1.1 states one reported instance where a function cannot be achieved via keyboard alone, user impact is critical, and keyboard only user will not be able to perform the function?
Okay, so we've got a critical issue. Just one. Their product is overall mostly accessible, but they've got one critical issue, and some users are not going to be able to perform a function because of that critical issue. So this then, in our role at the University of Washington, is advisory, and we will tell the people that are making the purchasing decision that this is pretty serious, and think about that function in the great scheme of things, what people are going to be using this product for, and where do you see that function? How critical is that function from your perspective? And is it possible to come up with some sort of workaround? If somebody can't perform that function, can they do so via some other means, not using this product? So you got to then be thinking about equivalent alternatives. And if ultimately it can't be done without this product, and therefore a keyboard user is just not going to be able to do it, then that's a huge problem and a huge risk. And it comes down then to, what's the scope of this purchase? Is this going to affect, students, faculty, staff throughout the entire university, or is it just a departmental thing? All those questions come into play. And, I usually have pretty strong recommendations that, you really, this is a significant risk. I wouldn't do this unless they fix it, get them on the hook to fix it. But ultimately it's up to them, and I have no authority, unfortunately. But we're getting more and more people that are listening to our recommendations, so that's a positive.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions I have so far in the chat. Thank you so much, Terry, for doing the presentations, and thank you for everybody for showing up to the webinar today. And right now it's also, we will be sending out a brief survey right after the webinar, and we will also be posting the recording. And the NW HIT also has another webinar coming up in June 9, titled Creating Inclusive Classroom Spaces in Which Student Thrives. It will be presented by Catherine Olson, the Dean of Faculty and professor of psychology from Reed College. So head to our website, nwheat.org, if you want to sign up. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.